Well, Fred, we are back once again and here entering on the very, very long trek that is Axiom 14.
Yeah, good to be here. Glad to be down to Axiom number 14, which is about, in the translation, 3,000 words long. The whole 18 axiom set is only about 6,000 words long. So Axiom 14 is as long as the rest of them put together.
Yeah, and not only is it long, but there's a large number of topics that it covers. It covers quite a lot of ground.
Yeah, it really does. I think I figured out what Polanus is doing here. Now, what to call this thing is anybody's guess. I think we're going to call it something like, what are we going to call it? Speaking of the persons in particular, something like that. It's sort of a set of rules for how to talk about each person of the Trinity, a person of the Trinity. And I think for whatever reason, I mean, Polanus's way of thinking pedagogically is still a little bit beyond me. I'm not totally tracking with him, but when he hits this one, he thinks, okay, if we're going to get the rules for how to talk about each person of the Trinity, a lot of distinctions occur to him, and he slips into this older mode of teaching that he used early in his career, which is this Ramist way of dichotomizing everything. And what he really loved, as any good Ramist, he loved not only that first distinction, but distinctions within each of those distinctions, and then especially twofold distinctions. They'll occasionally indulge in a threefold distinction, or at one point in this series, he'll do 10 subpoints under one of his distinctions. Mm-hmm. I think we talked in our very first episode about how Polanus's first big book of theology was the divisions of theology,
the
partitiones. Yeah. In my opinion, Axiom 14 is one of those partitiones, just dropped right into the middle of his syntagma.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that he smushes it all together. I think your analysis is definitely spot on. And like also thinking through here with you, like what to title this thing. Maybe something like the persons considered with respect to something.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because he takes a person and then he considers it with respect to the essence, with respect to the person himself, mm-hmm. with respect to other divine persons, and then I think he concludes with missions, which is the person with respect to a creature. I don't know if that holds out all the way through, but that's kind of how I've slotted it in my head. And, you look at someone like a Thomas Aquinas, whose divisions, are helpful just for a point of comparison. Mm-hmm. Each one of these would be its very own separate question.
Right.
And so it's fascinating to me that he would smush them together, even granted the fact that he really is partial to, his French brackets.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it really ought to be something like the 30 axioms, and this 14th axiom seems like it could be, it could be multiplied out into a number of them.
Yeah.
But I think he really wants to put it all together. Mm-hmm. So let me show a little diagram that I made to guide us through this 14th axiom. And all I did was I went back and I spent a little bit of time studying how Polanus made his own Ramist brackets back in the partitiones, and said, well, let me diagram it like he would have if he had provided a diagram. Because in the partitiones, he just 30 pages of these long, elaborate diagrams. Let's see, I'll share this screen. And there's the diagram. This will be on the blog where we post these videos. And you can see on the left, we're going to consider the divine persons. And then, of course, there's two ways to do that. Either commonly, so a divine person, as you said, with reference to what they have in common, or individually. And then under individually, he doesn't say anything specific there, but he says, well, there's two ways to consider a divine person individually, either absolutely or relatively. And then you can just see how that all opens up. Well, if you're going to do it relatively, it's either relative to the essence or to the other persons. And then each of those, I always say ramifies because it does sort of branch out, like a tree. I don't know if Peter Ramus, Pierre Ramu, I don't know if his name is connected to that verb ramify or not. It's something that always kind of
You
messes with
mentioned
the back of
that,
my head.
yeah, I think it was the first episode, and you used the word ramify in this context, and I thought to myself, oh wait, is that where we get that word?
I should
I
look
don't
that
know,
up.
but it struck me as well. Someone will have to look that up for us and let us know.
So I think that's that's kind of how to get this visual in mind so you can think through where we are in any given discussion. But to actually go to the text, he starts out by saying, one can consider any divine person either commonly or individually. That is, each person is said to be God either under the concept of the common essence or under the concept of the individual person. Let's see, anything we need to say about that?
I think just the legitimacy of making this distinction is really helpful. It might be something of a no-brainer for a lot of people, but just recognizing that we are able to make these considerations and then what we're doing when we are doing that. So we are introducing, again, a rational distinction, as we've talked about, and we just have to be careful that we don't slip by, ramifying things out, making these actual real distinctions in God.
Yeah. Yeah. So in this case, he's been talking all along about the Trinity as a whole, three persons, one being, and laying out some rules for that. And here he says, now if we're going to focus on each person, if we're just going to talk about the Father, for example, we can either talk about the Father either commonly or individually. So thinking commonly, he says, then one can consider each person in the essence as he is God. So if I were to just think of the Father, only that person, commonly speaking, then I would say, well, the Father is God.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a third of God. The Father has and is the divine essence. Why am I excluding the Son and the Spirit? Is there anything naughty or irregular about excluding the Son and the Spirit? I was going to only talk about the Father, and what I say when considering him commonly is Father is God.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely nothing naughty from the perspective of like historical orthodoxy, but very frequently today the impression is given that if you make this type of abstraction and you, as it were, leave the Son and Holy Spirit off to one side, then you're somehow depleting God, or you're somehow removing from him perfections in any sort of way. And that's really easy to slip into that sort of thinking, because after all, we are prescinding from who God also is, which is Son and Spirit. But when you think through it carefully, there's no more of God in the Father than in the Son, and therefore there's no less of God when you're, again, mentally abstracting. And this is in contrast to like it really being the case in God. We're only mentally abstracting, but we're able to do this, and we're able to do it truly. Is really important.
Yeah, I guess it does go back to the initial point of this axiom is if we're going to consider a divine person,
Right.
then we're going to say this one, the Father, this one divine person that I am now considering is God. And if you object, no, you can't say that unless you include the Son and the Holy Spirit, then you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the axiom and say, well, no, the whole point was we're talking about the legitimacy of considering a divine person.
Right. And like this additional statement here is really so incredibly technical when he says, quote, the divine essence does not have existence in the Son and Holy Spirit that is other than its existence in the Father, because the essence and divine existence don't differ. So that last statement is fairly familiar, I would expect, to most people who are going to be thinking about these things regularly, at least. That there's no real distinction, there's no extra existence that God has to be donated from a creature or from something outside him in order to actually be. His essence includes existence, and in fact just is existence. But because essence for us is an abstract thing that has to be instantiated in an individual. It has to be participated by an individual, and then added on to that individual, you have to have the act of existence, which of course is absolutely prior. It posits its own limiting principle, which is the essential principle of a creature. But nonetheless, because of this, we're very, very tempted to think that the essence is instantiated in the Father. And when it's instantiated in the Father, and also instantiated in the Son, and also in the Spirit, if we're not careful, that's where I think the main slippage is introduced in that tendency to think along those lines. So God, essentially speaking, has existence included in his essence by definition. And thus, when it's, again, quote unquote, instantiated in the Father, it doesn't now suddenly exist because it's been individualized. Rather, that's not the case.
Yeah. So it's always struck me as a pretty abstract point, when you read in Aquinas that essence and existence are the same in God. Abstract in the sense of I can get my mind around it. I can see in some ways why that's a necessary thing to affirm, that kind of Thomist way of talking about simplicity. Mm-hmm. It's not one thing for God to be and another thing for him to be
what he is.
The God he is. Yeah. And that's very different from humans, right? It's one thing for me to exist, but I could have been very different from this. And so my essence and my existence are different things. This is one of many possible essences that I could have existed with, I suppose. This is one way to talk and get off into existentialism there. But when you think about it in terms of the Trinity, this is kind of a Trinitarian corollary of that identification of essence and existence. Polanus draws the corollary: the divine essence doesn't have existence in the Son and Holy Spirit that is other than its existence in the Father. So it's not like, well, here's the Father's existence over here, and then there's the Son's existence over here. It's going to be the same existence, even though the Father's not the Son. The Father is the divine essence, the Son is the divine essence. And so it's always going to be pointing back to the same being.
Yeah, they all are the same act of existence. Is I think where this is wanting to push us. And a lot of 20th century theology would very much be bristling at this point. Particularly, so as far as I see it, and I'm not an expert on Barth, so if you want, please do correct me, of course. But it seems to me that the mode of being language, which I don't have issue with as a term, just as a term, doesn't bother me. I do think you lose something when you start not talking about persons, but you also lose the wrong associations that are attendant, especially today, which can be a good thing. But when you start talking about a way of being or mode of being, I think the tendency is to start talking about diverse acts of existences, again, which actualize the underlying whatness of God within each person. And I think that's a serious error that is at least latent, perhaps, in that sort of way of talking. And Polanus is going to mention the mode of being language later. It's common. It's not incredibly common, I don't think, to the tradition, but it's certainly well represented. It's not. But it's just an interesting point, especially from the perspective of 20th century theology, which means it in a certain way. We have to be careful.
I think Polanus will bring it in just straight from the Greek, right? Tropos huparcheos, which is it's right there in the Greek tradition, and
for sure.
I guess the pressure here is you keep wanting to say, okay, so the Father, the existence of the Father is the existence of the divine essence. He is God, and that's not a different existence of the divine essence than the Son. And the pressure you feel, the reason that kind of feels wrong is, but the Father and the Son are not the same person. And I would just come back here and say, that's right, that's another thing we have to say, but it's not something we can say when we're talking about a divine person with reference to what they have in common. We're necessarily going to feel a pressure to identify the Father with the divine essence, that if we then switch over and say, okay, now let's talk about the Son, then we're going to have that same exact problem, because to back out and get these statements that distinguish them, they necessarily have to be relational statements.
Right.
Which is not what we're doing under the category of what can be said about each divine person.
Right. We're considering the person only with respect to this at the moment.
Yeah. So it's frustrating, because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, but the Father's not the Son. Right. And the only way to say that is to make a sentence that includes the Father and the Son in it.
That's a really profound statement. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'm going to remember that line, though.
Yeah. It's only relationally that you'll be able to get them. And this is all of Axiom 14 is not after that project.
Yeah, that's great.
So the last statement in this little subparagraph is, rather, all persons of the deity subsist in one and the same essence.
Mm-hmm.
Subsist always sounds like much more of a technical term than I guess it really is. It's existence in particular within something.
Yeah. The reason why we use subsist in contrast to like substand, which is not a very common word in English or even in like philosophical English. Substand literally means to stand under, and which is why we name substances, because they quote unquote stand under accidents, which come in on not particularized, but qualify and define internally what that substance is. Mm-hmm. So when we want to talk about an individual, but we don't want to indicate that he can receive accidents, we talk about subsistence. Because that does not mean to stand under, it means to it's also not existent. So that's another thing that we want to avoid. So existent, again, this is a little bit of lexical data perhaps that people aren't so interested in, but the reason why these terms are favored in contrast to others. So like if we were to say the person of the deity exists in one and the same essence, mm-hmm. To exist in Aristotelian philosophy literally means to stand outside one's causes. And what that means is that you are causally determined, you are a composite, of course, and you're really distinct from those things that are causing you to be either what or that you are, these sorts of things. So that's why we also, in very, very technical philosophy, are avoiding those sorts of terms, because to exist is for a creature to stand in the world, mm-hmm. to be not only the individual causes, particularly the maybe his existence in essence, we could just reduce it to for ease, but actually to be those in a primal sort of unity, mm-hmm. in stand erect, as it were. We're almost sounding very Heideggerian at the moment. You can forgive me for that.
So it's fairly harmless to say the Father exists and the Son also exists.
Right.
But then if you say, do they have different existences, is where you're going to realize, oh, no, I can't say the Father has an existence over here that is different from the Son's existence over here. That's not what I mean when I say the fairly harmless way, a harmless, loose way of putting it. The Father exists and the Son exists.
For sure.
Because the existence in which they are, that's going to be common.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And they're not required to actualize that existence. Because if they were, then it would be particularized or proper to one of them or to all of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and you'd know you got the wrong answer because you would have multiplied substances.
Right.
I mean, at that point, it's not tricky to say, oh, exactly, yeah. All I wanted to say was that, the Father is not the Son, and they stand in relation to each other. Yeah. But when I said the Father exists and also the Son exists, and then I followed that out by positing that they had distinct existences, unintentionally, I multiplied. I didn't mean to multiply the divine essence. Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's always been helpful for me to think about things this way, but um, the tendency, the need we have in Trinity to double speak.
Mm.
We talk, reduplication is often the technical term that's thrown around, but to be only able to say things and to always have to come around and say another thing. So father and son have to occur in the same sentence, as you really put it well. But that, is a statement that allows us to really distinguish. Whereas when we're doing the essence, we can do other things. It seems to me that this is just a feature of our creaturely compositeness that is always splitting who, the absolute simple God in this very precise sort of way. I don't know if that's helpful for others, or maybe that's not quite correct, but I've always thought about it along those lines. Is this requirement to reduplicate is simply a feature of my creatureliness.
Yeah. I think Augustine talks about in Confessions, where he has the vision in Ostia when he's in conversation with Monica about the afterlife. He says, they went up and they went to the place where the Lord feeds his people with truth for food, but it couldn't last and they had to come back down. And he says, we came back down to where sentences have beginnings and endings. And I think, well, that's that, except for that one book of Confessions, I guess that's where we all live all the time as theologians, where sentences have beginnings and endings, and they start one way, they traverse a certain path and end another way. And then you got to put another sentence on there to get to the other side of the truth that you had to exclude to get that sentence finished. Yeah. This is I guess this is what leads to theological writer's block, right? Anything you want to say, you think, got to say everything at once. Like, no, you're finite, you're a creature. You can't say everything at once. You got to lay that out and then build on the next with the precept that follows from it.
And maybe one more point. I know we're kind of spending a lot of time on this, but a point of application, and maybe this is just kind of a personal testimony, but realizing that is really useful because you feel that that incredible pressure as a theologian to be saying everything all at once at one time. And as you say, that theological writer's block. But it's a really helpful application to realize we have to work it out bit by bit, carve out our days in faithfulness, but then also to recall that when we encounter the theology of other writers and kind of gather it back up, this is an intense intellectual exercise that is not reducible to, the distribution of sentences on a page. It is an intellectual repeating of the effort that theologian himself has undergone to eke out those sentences in that sort of order. And so, like, doing theology is a performance of the intellect, which is a very intense and difficult exercise, far more than it would be if it was merely reciting sentences off a page and gathering them up in some haphazard way. It's incredible.
Even when you mentioned saying something critical about Bart's kind of an ultimate test case of this, right? Because you can look at any 5 pages and say, well, I disagree with what he did there, but I've got to bear in mind the surrounding 150 pages,
right?
And kind of how this all plays out.
It's true.
And it takes a lot of trust to say, well, Bart's not just messing with me. He's doing a dialectical thing where he's balancing large arrangements of topics. And it doesn't mean he's infallible, but it does mean, like, you kind of catch your breath before you say, I think he's wrong about this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that is considering each person in terms of thinking commonly about them. So what they have in common. Polanus goes on to say, considering each singularly, as opposed to commonly, then one can also think about a person in 2 ways. Singularly, it can be either absolutely or relatively. Now, I think we'll only get through this first distinction, right? That considering them singularly, and then under that, absolutely.
Yeah, and I do want to just flag right here my uncomfortability with the word absolutely.
Yeah.
If we don't understand it very carefully and I don't think Polanus has used a wrong word here or anything like that, but it simply means by themselves.
Yeah.
Simply means by themselves. So we don't absolutize the person, as you mentioned, they're only relation-wise, but nonetheless, we can think of them only by themselves, and that's what absolutely means in this context.
Yeah, the word absolute, we still use it in English that way when we're talking about, say, English grammar, or in math, right? Absolute value. So, just the value considered in itself.
Right.
But it gets used more loosely, both in common English for other topics and in philosophy sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you take the person absolutely, in himself or where he is with respect to himself, that is, according to his nature as he is God, and according to his act of subsisting, whereby he subsists in himself and through himself. So a lot of self-referential language there, right? In himself, through himself. It's just the person, not relatively, not in terms of relation to other things, but just by himself. In that way, the person considered with respect to himself is autotheos. So here's this Greek word. It's got a complex history inside of Reformed scholasticism. Does it? I should know this. Does it also have a history prior to that sort of Reformed development of it?
I'm not aware of that. I'm fairly familiar with the significant controversy that Calvin introduces, and eventually the Roman Catholics respond very aggressively against him. So, for instance, Pierre Montoya, whose volume on Trinity, 1,000 folio pages long, in Latin, is very long. His first chapter is on the heresy of the autotheons.
Yeah. So that's a 16th century conversation.
Right.
That becomes part of the polemical heritage, and it gets developed inside of Reformed theology. Maybe that's enough to know at this point, is that Polanus is finding within his Ramist architecture here, the place within those branches, there's the one place where you can say autotheos, and this is where it belongs. If you're considering each person singularly and absolutely, without reference to the others, or without reference to the divine essence, right? You're just thinking about the person. Then each is autotheos. Now, this applies to the Father, because the Father is God of himself. God not from another, but from himself. Is that a decent way of talking about autotheos? Yeah,
I think so.
The controversial part is here, it applies to any of the divine persons. So it would also apply to the Son. The Son is, in fact, in this way, autotheos, God of himself. Now, the objection is, no, he's not. He's from the Father. He's God of God, light of light. How much more obviously Nicene could you be than to say God of God? But Polanus would say, no, remember where we are under the subject headings here. We're only talking about a divine person absolutely considered of himself. The Son is autotheos in this regard.
Right. And I think that's the critical point, as you mentioned, is just remember where we are and be extremely careful in what we're asserting. We're asserting that no one gives godness to any one of the persons.
Yeah. Right. And that's, of course, again, the pressure is you want to say, but wait, the doctrine of eternal generation informs me that the Son is who he is as the one from the Father. That's the difference. Right. And that you have to do justice to that in another part of the overall witness to the truth.
Right. And yeah, this is very easy to slip up on. So for instance, I think personally Calvin slipped up on this pretty bad, and which is one of the reasons why the Catholics reacted so extremely. So for instance, there's a letter that I've translated that he was engaging a guy named Chapineau, who was one of the consistory members at a neighboring Reformed village, with Calvin, who was accusing Calvin of heresy on this very point. And this is part of the lengthy autotheon troubles that Calvin engaged throughout a number of years. And Calvin at one point says that the persons are aliud et aliud. And I recall we mentioned some point earlier, that's not something we say.
Yeah.
So there are incongruities within the Reformed tradition. Now Calvin didn't mean aliud et aliud, even though he said it. I think we should give Calvin the benefit of the doubt. He's not technically a theologian. He's a lawyer. He's a very intelligent, very steeped in theology, but he's not quite so technical. Here, Polanus is really doing well, I think, in someone like a Gisbardus, which also has a wonderful piece on this specific issue of autotheos. All we have to remember is that this is where we are, where we affirm this only here, and this doesn't mean we collapse into something like aliud et aliud. It's very easy to do.
Right, because if Calvin meant that in full earnestness, out of context, it would be one thing and another thing.
Right.
Within God, and that's you can't square that with anything else he says in Institutes, Book 1, Chapter 13, where he's clearly intending to be Nicene and succeeding in being Nicene time after time, quoting lots of Nazianzus. The illustration or the elaboration that Polanus gives of this is each person with respect to himself is autotheos, God having the divine essence, which exists from the essence itself and through itself, and not from another essence or through another essence. He's not going to go all the way of using language like self-caused, because that's probably not even a logically coherent thing to try to contend for. But the question of how does one possess the divine essence? God has the divine essence, and the divine essence exists from itself and through itself, and not from another essence. Thus, and so maybe that's enough on autotheos. The way he spells this out is really interesting, though. He says one says the Father is wise with respect to himself, not with respect to the Son. He is wise, not from that wisdom whom he begets.
That's a quotation from Augustine, by the way, I believe.
Oh, is it really? Interesting.
Either a pretty explicit one, or certainly an allusion. Augustine says that precise thing. He's not wise from the wisdom he begets. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Even though he does beget wisdom, and we can talk hypostatically of the Son as the wisdom of God, even within the being of the Trinity, not with reference to the incarnation.
Right.
Nevertheless, you don't want to say the Father is not wise in himself. He is only wise in the Son.
Right.
Then you'd have this problem of an unwise Father, who then in some other phase went on to be wise because he's always got the Son with him.
Right. He's not God's essential wisdom, nor does the Father need the Son in order to be wise, which is, again, the Trinity is not actualizing the divine essence. It's the same principle, just repeated here in a different way.
So let me push that a little bit. One of Athanasius's knockdown arguments against the Arians was, if you claim that God can exist without his logos, and the logos is a creature, the highest creature, but a creature on the Arian view, then you're calling God a logos, or, unwise or unknowledgeable. That's for Athanasius, that's a knockdown argument, to assert the necessity of the Son's eternal existence in unity with the Father. What would we say about that within the structure Polanus has here? That it's that's true with regard to the relation of the Father and the Son, if we're going to talk about them in relation. But if we're talking about the divine essence, it would be a mistake to say that a person of the Trinity is only wise when taken in conjunction with another person of the Trinity.
Yeah, that's an incredibly technical issue, as you know, to try to navigate so precisely what we want to do with those sorts of issues. But I think Polanus here is following someone like a Thomas Aquinas very, very closely on this point. So there's going to be variance on the tradition on this very question. There's going to be certain theologians who tend to favor the ability of our ability to demonstrate the Trinity from natural reason and natural creation, and and that line is going to need you to collapse wise and wisdom, a wise and personalized wisdom. Someone like a Thomas, who does not allow you to do that, would assert that the Son is the fruit of the Father's essential wisdom in act, which produces, again, the Word, which is the Logos. So this is one of a very large nexus of issues that, depending on how you fall, particularly on the issue of whether natural revelation is sufficient or not, for a philosopher to demonstrate the Trinity, if you accept that, then that argument holds. If you reject that, it does not. I personally don't accept it. But,
yeah. And you're thinking about the kind of argument that would be that would go like this: a merely monopersonal God is incoherent because such a God would not have self-knowledge.
Right.
And therefore, what I just did there is, I could spell that out in a few more steps, but I just demonstrated from the principles of natural reason and an analysis of what self-knowledge is, kind of the phenomenology of self-knowledge. I just demonstrated from that necessity of the Trinity. And some people think you can do that or talk like you can do that.
Yeah.
Richard of St. Victor kind of talks like you can do that. There's debate about whether he really thought that or how Anselmian he's being.
Anselm did.
Who's the... Oh, Raymond Lull.
Yes, he's the famous guy that the neo-scholastics were very upset with, and oh man, God, they long diatribes against Lull.
Yeah, but if you take Thomas to be sort of in the mainstream here by saying, actually, even once the Trinity has been revealed, even given the Trinity, Trinitas Posita. Even after that, you can't demonstrate from principles of natural reason the necessity of the Trinity. It's a strict mystery. It's a mystery. It's a
piece of faith that we can gain some understanding of, but faith has to be engaged prior to seeking that understanding.
Yeah. So I guess when Athanasius does his knockdown argument, it'd be interesting to spell out exactly what he's doing. It strikes me as being similar to when he says, God created humanity and then it was going to ruin. And what was he going to do? He was in a bind. He couldn't let it fail. You could read that as an argument for the necessity of
it's more creates, of a fittingness. It's more of an absolute fittingness argument, which, personally, I also think that argument fails. You can't even prove, right? Natural reason can't even prove, at least if you're a Thomist, you can't even prove the possibility of the Trinity, and therefore fittingness doesn't have anything to do. But I can see how that sort of argument functions and can be convincing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And Athanasius isn't he's not doing that kind of apologetic. He's telling the story of redemption in a way that maximally highlights the fittingness all the way back into the eternal being of God. I mean, there's a reason On the Incarnation it's such a classic. People read it and immediately, get what's going on. It's just, you can accidentally read it as being like necessary proofs about the demonstrability of the Trinity or the hard necessity of God redeeming whatever he creates. You say, oh, well, that's a mistake in interpreting Athanasius. Polanus is up to a different project here.
Yeah.
I've run into this when I've worked on the doctrine of blessedness, which Polanus also has in his previous volume. And actually, I was just looking at the other day, he's got 4 axioms on blessedness, is how he develops his teaching on the doctrine of divine beatitude. I've thought about it because it's tempting to say the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit together are blessed in a beautiful community of blessedness, and they, rejoice in the presence of each other as the one God. But you actually want to, following this insight, you want to go back and say, no, the Father has to be blessed in himself. Like each person that you talk about has to be blessed as the possessor of the divine essence. Otherwise, you have the problem of the Father wasn't blessed until he had the Son, and then, logically speaking, once the Father and Son are in communion, then blessedness emerges from that communion or something. And this is the insight that makes you say, no, actually, blessedness has to be in the divine essence. And each person of the Trinity has to have it. And then we're doing something else when we reflect on the community of blessedness among the 3 persons in the one divine essence.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, last thing on this subheading. He illustrated it with reference to wisdom. One says the Holy Spirit is wise not from the Son, whom one says is the wisdom of the Father. The Holy Spirit is wise with respect to himself, because the Holy Spirit is God. And in God, being wise is the same as being God. So no surprise, a pretty heavy deployment of simplicity in multiple senses here.
Right.
When we're talking about a
Simplicity
person of the
in a
Trinity.
complex sense.
It's very complex simplicity, that's right. But you'd expect it to show up here where he's talking about a person, absolutely.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, that is our introduction to the 14th axiom. And when we come back, we'll be able to talk about the person's, each person, I should say, relative to something else.
That's right. All right. Well, I'll look forward to that, Fred, next time.
All right. Great.
Yep.
Good to see you, Ryan.
You as well.